It's not just mine, his or her house. This is our house.
Tyrone Lowe. Hello, everyone. My name is Tyrone Lowe, host and producer of the show Legends. And I have to guess today, he's a legend, and I mean a legend. I bring to you Victor Simonelli. Hey.
Hey, great to be with you, Tyrone. Thanks for having me.
Oh, man, it's always a pleasure. So we're going to talk about the beginning of when you actually started DJing, and I mean from the beginning.
Sure. Well, you know, before actually spinning, my father, he was a record collector. And, I'm born into a household full of records. He had all types of music. And my earliest memories are going through his collection and pulling out tunes that I've, a lot of covers were interesting back then. You know, we're talking early 70s. So,
right.
The album covers very interesting back then. And I'd pull them out. I'd ask him to play them. He was very meticulous about his collection, and he didn't want them touched too much. So he'd play them. Frequently, he would play them and record them on cassette, and then just play the cassette. But the point I'm trying to make is he exposed me to a lot of music, and he taught me how to listen. When he would play stuff for me, he would ask me how it made me feel, what I thought of it, what lyrics did I hear in it. And he'd sort of act it out as it was playing too, as if he was the musician or the performer. So for a young person, that's really influential, having that at home. And one day, going through his collection, I came across one that looked very plain. It looked very plain, because with covers, they were very colorful and entertaining sometimes. But this one I pulled out was very plain, and it was the Universal Robot Band's Dance and Shake It Tambourine, which is
okay. Yeah, I remember that.
Remember that, right?
I remember that, yes.
That was a great record, and that was the first 12-inch I ever touched, the Patrick Adams production, going from memory. And it stood out to me because how plain it looked, but it sounded great. And the big difference was it was one song on the side of a 12-inch, not several, like an album.
Right.
So that really opened my eyes to a whole new world, and that got me more interested in singles, 12-inch singles, which were just starting at that time.
Right.
Eventually, my dad started doing parties. He'd rent dance halls and just give parties for children locally. And what could I say? That was my first experience in the booth helping him.
Okay. So when did you actually start playing,
right.
At that point?
So from there, I started to do just mobile parties. Back then, block parties were popular, so I'd have to carry all the equipment, and
right.
You know how that could be.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Very. Yeah. We had the amp, we had the speakers, the mixer, records, of course, milk crates back then.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So I know about that.
I know you do. I know you do.
It's funny that you talk about that because the newer generation don't really know about the manual part of what we did back in those days, man. 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, man, we're disconnecting a system and we're carrying bass bottoms and mid-range speakers and also carrying crates of records, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, man.
That's the truth. And how about packing it up, unpacking it and packing it back up?
Exactly,
and then,
yeah.
You said it. It's a big job. And, I guess, look, everything had its positives and negatives. I love the sound of vinyl. And, fast forwarding till today, we're traveling with USBs now, which that has its benefits, but, it also has its negatives too.
Right.
I love the physical aspect of records and touching them, feeling them. And it was a visual as well. It was a visual reference for your brain.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, Victor, as in the beginning of being a DJ, did you have an actual DJ that actually influenced you? Because we always, when in the beginning, I had someone that actually influenced me to be like a role model. When he was playing, like, I want to be like him one day,
That's a very good question. Back then in New York, we had great radio, and you know, with WBLS and 92 KTU and well, 98.7 KISS at the time was 99 XWXLO. And I'm
Right.
late 70s, early 80s. And a lot of DJs were on there. So aside from seeing my dad, the first experience I had hearing DJs outside of my dad was probably on radio, New York radio. And some of those DJs, I mean, there was Ted Courier, there was Jellybean Benitez.
Right.
Fast forward into the, you know, 82, 83, then Timmy Regisford and Boy Jarvis were on. Shep Pettibone, Tony Humphries was on.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure you listen to all these guys too.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I know most of them as well. You know, growing up on a personal note. So from then, from the 70s to the 80s, and to now, how do you look at the transition as far as from them? Because back then we were more manual, and now everything is more technical. So let's talk about your experience as far as the transition.
Yeah, it is. It's a good point you make. It's very, very technical now. In fact, sometimes overcomplicated, isn't it? It seems, yeah, it seems like in many ways things were much more simple then. Oh, I had a point to make. Right. One period in there that I wasn't too fond of was when we were dealing with CDs.
Okay.
You know, it's between vinyl, when vinyl was sort of going downhill, and you know, the download thing hadn't taken off yet. There was a period there when we were dealing with CDs, and what really bothered me about that is the manufacturing was almost put on us, where we had to burn, right? We had to burn the CDs, write all the info, and in regards to what you said about the technical aspect of it, having to do that, it was I found it a bit draining with how much CDs had to be burned and how much information had to be written on them, and I frankly, I just found it boring burning CDs. You know,
for me, transition from 1200s to CDJs was something that I overlooked, because I always thought that vinyl was always going to stay. And when the Pioneer first came out with the first CDJs, I'm like, oh, that's only going to be temporary. You know what I'm saying? But I wasn't aware that it was actually going to be something that was actually going to overtake our craft. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I thought 12 inches, I thought 1200s were permanent. I mean, they were the standard for how many years?
Many years.
Right. It's really hard to believe. I thought, but look, we have to look to the next generation. I mean, always forward thinking. And if we get stuck with what's what, you know, we could get left behind.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's important for us to evolve.
So let's talk about production. And I mean, you got a lot of production, you know, from what I've listened to you, and I've listened to some of your production. You're a beast in the studio, you know. Let's talk about your first production that you ever, you know, conducted.
Yeah, that's a great question. Before production, I was editing tape. Back then, in the mid 80s, editing tape was a popular thing to do. In fact, if you remember stuff like the Big Apple mixes or the Hollywood mixes, you know, Deadly Medleys, and releases like that, they were just basically bootlegs, but there were so many tunes within the frame of 15 minutes, if you remember.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, and just spinning. I was, at the time, I wondered how that was being done until I discovered tape editing.
Right.
So from tape editing was sort of the first step in the direction of production. So after some years of tape editing, I went to Center for Media Arts in
right.
And when I graduated from there, I spent about 6 to 8 months trying to get a job at a studio. And when I say a job, just an internship. I mean, just a foot in the door to be in the environment.
Right.
So I eventually did do that. And I got a job at a place called Shakedown Sound, which was owned by Arthur Baker. And a lot of the producers and the DJs of the time and artists of the time were working there. But I started as an intern, and slowly but surely worked my way into editing tape for them. And he laid a lot of major label projects on me. One of the first ones that I edited for him was Will Downing. It was on Island Records. And gosh, I was so nervous because it was my first real, you know, edit gig.
Right.
You know? And Will had been doing anonymous releases back then, like, let me think of some of those artist names. Wally Jump Jr. And, yeah, in any case, I got experience with editing, and then slowly Arthur would ask me to come into the studio with him while he was mixing and watch what he was doing. And he'd ask me what pieces I want or what pieces would be helpful to me. And I'd say, you know, so eventually that led into production. So he had an act name at the time called the Brooklyn Funk Essentials. And I was, Lenny was another guy working there, Lenny D.
Okay.
And Lenny D and I got together around then and just experimenting with production, because we were both working at Shakedown amongst many other people. Gail Sky King was there. There was, Latin Rascals was shortly before me. Junior Vasquez. There was a load of people in there. But he said, you're both from Brooklyn, so why don't you just go with the name Brooklyn Funk Essentials? We did that for a while.
Okay.
We did that for a while. That eventually became a band, which is not us. But during that late 80 period, and maybe up until 90, 91, we were using that name that he gave us as a remix production team. And you asked me about my first production. It's hard to remember the very first production, but some of the first releases I have were on Vendetta Records and New Groove. I'm not sure if you remember New Groove.
I remember New Groove, of course, yeah.
And
it wasn't a popular label at the time, but it was an off-brand. But I remember, yeah.
Yeah, it was. To tell you the truth, it's really what Strictly Rhythm eventually sort of based their whole idea on. It's sort of the blueprint for what came into the, you know, independence, what they did in the 90s. So those were labels that I was working with back then. And Fourth Floor was another.
Okay. Well, you know, Victor, we're gonna take a little break and for commercial purposes, and we'll be right back with the legendary Victor Simonelli.
It's not just mine, his or her house. This is our house.
We got some fun people in the house tonight.
This is our house.
We're back with the legendary Victor Simonelli. Hey, Victor.
Yeah.
You know, let's tell the viewers about what you're doing now and how you actually upgraded yourself. But first and foremost, you played around the world.
Right, and that didn't come quickly. So I mean, picking up where we left off before in the late 80s, when I was working at Shakedown, I got the experience there. He laid a lot of major label stuff on me to work on back then.
Right.
He gave me projects like Quincy Jones with Shaka Khan, Ray Charles, Talking Heads. I eventually ended up editing a version of Michael Jackson in the Closet, which is the only duet he ever did with Madonna. And you know, that was released as Michael Jackson featuring the Mystery Girl, and Naomi Campbell was in the video. I guess they were just contractual things that didn't allow me to. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is putting all this pressure on. I even got a James Brown. That Michael Jackson came through Tommy Mustard, the James Brown came through David Morales, and all these projects coming my way, working with all these other people, really gave me a feel for how to do it and what to do. So going back to your question, you asked how I get, repeat your question, because I lost it.
Let's talk about how you actually upgraded yourself from being a producer and a DJ and how you actually traveled around the world.
I'm sorry, right. Thank you very much.
Because every time I speak to you, you get ready to get on the plane.
I apologize. Well, the way that happened is I had been producing, you know, and having these experiences I just explained for several years. And then 91 came around and I did this release titled I Want You to Know by Groove Committee. And that came out on New Groove. And from that, it started to get attention. This was the first time that other DJs were really calling me for what I was doing. And that record opened doors to people from other parts of the world calling me. And one of those places was Japan. And a friend named Gomi, who still is producing, he asked me if I'd like to go to Japan with him and play, I believe it was a New Year's Eve party. This is probably around I believe it's 91.
Okay.
Yeah, and I went to Japan. I played that party. I came back to New York, and shortly after that, a call came from England because they liked this record titled "Do You Want Me, Baby" by Cloud9 that I had done. And
Okay.
yep, and then word travels. You know how people talk to people, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Most definitely.
So that opened the doors to going other places. Then I got calls from Italy, I got calls from Switzerland, and I got calls from Germany, and then Spain and all over Europe. And then I got calls from Asia again, back to Japan, went to Hong Kong, and it really started to open up. It was sort of like a domino effect. And so from the 90s, from that early 90 period until now, until earlier this year, I've been traveling nonstop, pretty much, not every weekend, but very frequently.
Right.
And again, for younger DJs and people coming up, releases and spinning go hand in hand. So it's very important for us to let people know what we're doing, because it's sort of a calling card for us.
Right.
For people to know what we're doing. So all the way up till earlier this year, when before COVID came in, thankfully and thank God, it's a blessing to be able to do this. So I was working steadily with gigs, but now since COVID came in, that's all, obviously that's all stopped since very early March.
Last time that we spoke together, you played at LeBain's.
LeBain, that's right. Isn't that a great party?
We chatted that night, and when you got on, I see that you really had a good crowd reaction, man, when you were playing. Let's talk about Tony Lee, because that's a big record, and even though you invited me to do a remix on it, I seen you had about 15 or 16 remixes on it already.
Well, hey, I got news for you. There's about 15 more coming for 2020.
I can imagine, It's just that I just didn't have the time. You know what I was doing. I'm in the studio doing other things, and maybe one day I'll get a chance to do it. But how did you come about Tony Lee and Status 4?
I would love to hear what you do if and when you get some time. But yeah, meeting Tony was through Paul Simpson, a mutual friend.
Oh, matter of fact, I caught you guys' idea when I did the mixtape.
Yes.
You guys were we was in the studio, and they was practicing off my mix, and all of a sudden they heard the remix, remember?
I know it. Man. You just gave us a taste, though. Come on now. Well, when I talked to Tony that night, and he sent me the record, and he said, Tyrone, I want you to break this. I don't really try to sound like everybody else. And if you give me something else, I'm going to do something different with it, And he was very, very appreciative about it. So we all appreciate it, Tyrone. What you're doing is amazing. And the collective you're putting together here with interviews is just like no other. Just keep on keeping on, brother. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Yes. So getting back to your question, though, in regards to meeting Tony, so I met Tony through Paul, and it took some time before we picked up and worked together. But when we did get together to talk about it, the idea came up. Tony had written the Status 4 single back in '83, You Ain't Really Down.
Right.
With Joe Tucci. They're the two writers. And he released Reach Up prior to that. You did that interview, so obviously you know all those details.
Exactly, yeah.
But when we got together, the idea came up of actually having them collaborate on one release together as artists, as performers. So we did that, and we brought these young men in. They're named the Young Men of Character. They're young guys that Tony mentors to, and they're great children and really talented. And we brought them all together in the studio and recorded that Don't Stop, Keep Rising. And it's a real honor to be part of that. And I'm just so happy to be able to work with them.
Are you doing something new with them now as well? Let's
Yeah.
talk about that.
Sure. So I'm working on something now for Tony. I haven't started anything new for Status 4, but something independently for Tony. He is he's into poetry and some spoken word. So that's not a road he's went down before, as far as I know. So hearing some of it is really heartfelt and sincere material. So I'm really happy to be a part of that, and I'm creating for him. That's work in progress. Yeah.
Okay.
And some of the other things I'm working on something for Robert Owens, a remix for Robert Owens.
Okay.
And I am working on something for Paul Simpson as well, a remix for Paul Simpson.
And Paul's been around for a very long time, man.
Paul is awesome.
I would love to have him on my show, man, because Paul Simpson was like he was a god back in like the like in the 80s, man, you know, and
absolutely. And Winston Jones too. Remember Paul?
Yeah, yes.
Such influences, and gosh, I'm still a big fan.
Okay.
You know?
So even though we have the pandemic going on, Victor, I'm sure that you have any type of projection of what you're going to be doing in the future or after this thing dies down a little bit. You have any proposals?
It's a very good question. First of all, I think we all have to be careful during this time. So
Most definitely, yes.
It's something to be taken very serious. And after this, it's let's take it one day at a time. I hope that we can get back to parties and events. I hope. I know that's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, I read the other day that Broadway isn't even planned to open until mid-2021.
Wow.
And that venues and our scene is most likely going to be after that. I'm speaking to people in other parts of the world, and they're saying similar. I've heard in Australia, New Zealand, that's starting to flow a bit more now because there's a lot less cases there. But again, traveling, that's just restricted now. So yeah, I mean, put it this way: one positive that this whole period has given me is being able to focus on productions and get releases out there. So I have several labels. I have Baseline, Big Tracks, Brooklyn Tracks, Stellar, Westside, and Unknown. And these are record labels that I put together over the years. And these labels have material going back to late 80s until current.
Right.
And so I have been uploading a lot of that material to Track Source, and just some of the other projects I'm working on. Just to complete that last question you asked, I'm working on something for Lee John as well from Imagination, and something for D-Train, and something for Rance Allen that Glenn Toby produced. God rest his soul, Rance Allen.
Okay.
An amazing artist he was.
Any shout outs to anybody?
Well, to my family, my wife, Martina, my son Emmanuel, my son Antonino, my son Christopher, my whole family, and just anyone and everyone that follows us and loves our music. I just want to say a heartfelt thank you and appreciate your love.
Well, Victor, it's been a pleasure to have you on my show. And thank you for being very informative. And you young guys out there, listen to this footage because there's a lot of things from back in the day that actually paid for you guys to be where you guys are right now. Even though technology took its course, but some history needs to be known about how this thing called DJing and production actually occurred, And like I said, this is another T-Lo video production, and stay tuned for another episode. And again, Victor Simonelli, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyrone. I love you, and I really appreciate you having me.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the love of house,
the dynamic soul sounds of
for the love of
DJ Tyrone Lowe. DJ Tyrone Lowe. The dynamic soul sounds of DJ Tyrone Lowe.
It's not just mine, his or her house. This is our house.
My assignment, my calling is to inspire, uplift.
You have to make sure your people are partying.
All I want to do is just bring joy to the dance floor and watch people dance.
Tino.